So, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming by again today for part two. Actually, I wasn't planning to do a part two of this, but everybody kept asking me, so here we are. So, but before we get started, I want to make mention of our Cannery Road Days project. Many of you know that last 3 years we've done Cannery Road Days, which is actually a couple of months program, and usually it's in the fall. But we held off this year for a couple of reasons. One of the main reasons is this year we're going to focus on the log from the Sea of Cortez, and we are waiting for the arrival of the Western Flyer, which will arrive in Monterey in January or early February. And so we're going to start the program in February and probably cover a couple of months. There'll be more details about it as we go along here. So see if we can get started here. If I can share the screen. Oh, wrong thing. Sorry. Hang on. What did I do here? Here I am. Push the wrong button. Here we go. That's what I want here. All right. I'm not a very technical person, as you all know. All right. And we want to. Hang on. Huh, look at that. So you all see that, I hope. So again, dancing on the belly of the shark. This we're going to focus on a couple different things. I know last time I focused a lot on abalone, and I don't know if I got through all the abalone, but we're going to pick up. This sort of relates to abalone in a way. So this particular photograph you see here was taken about 1908 by Heydrich, who was a Monterey photographer, famous for his big panorama photographs. In fact, he developed this special pivot on his tripod so he could make these long panoramic images. And he was also the guy responsible for all the photographs for the local schools. And oftentimes, if you look at Monterey High School classes and the photographs taken by Heydrich in the 1930s, you'll very often see the same guy standing on one end of the photograph, and you'll see him on the other end because he'll run as the camera makes that spin. But this wonderful photograph of a basking shark that was caught by this guy right here, this guy named Louis Perez. Louis Perez was known as the Fish King. In fact, he was such a great fisherman. They used to hold these big dinners at the Hotel Del Monte, selling stock into his fishing company. The time he caught this, it was sort of unusual, and you can see the net still wrapped around it, and then he swam into his net and he brought it into Monterey, and everybody went down to take a look at it. It was a very exciting event. He actually worked with a family. The Duarte family had a number of businesses along the Monterey Wharf that catered to the tourist trade. According to the local newspaper, they actually constructed a tent over this particular animal, and they were charging folks 50 cents to go down there and look at it. Which is actually a lot of money in 1908. And according to the newspaper, it was there for 10 days. So I imagine that it looked like this after those 10 days. That's actually also taken about 1908. This was taken on a beach near Seaside, right near the hotel that's there, and also by Heydrich. And these are soldiers from the Presidio who went down. I imagine that didn't smell that good right there, but that's also a Heydrich photograph. So this is my friend Pop Ernest Dolter, the Abalone King, who I talked about last time. Pop Dolter opened the very first restaurant on the Monterey Wharf in 1919. And of course, being the Abalone King, he had lots of abalone shells. At that time, there was a law. They couldn't actually ship them out of the state. So oftentimes they just dumped the shells over the wharf, over the side of the wharf, or they trucked them out to Seaside and Sand City and Marina, just dumped them in the sand dunes there. He would give them away. If you take walks through old Monterey neighborhoods, oftentimes you'll see the gardens lined in abalone shell, or there's abalone embedded into the cement walls. All that shell probably came from this pile you see right here. But when he opened his restaurant on the wharf in 1919, he was always looking ways to market his restaurant. He was a master at marketing himself. So notice that fez that he's wearing. He always wore this fez. Nobody knows why, and not even his family. I believe it's something that he got at the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco in 1915. At that time, he was living in San Francisco, and people remembered him. and more importantly, people remembered his restaurant. So he was always looking for ways to market this restaurant. And in the early 1920s, he concocted this idea to take folks out on his abalone boat. Here it is, the Pop Ernest, and to hunt basking sharks for reasons no one been able to explain at this point. Beginning in the spring about 1923, large numbers of basking sharks began to appear into the bay. And by the way, basking sharks are the second largest fish in the world. Whale sharks are the largest. But basking sharks are pretty docile. They don't have teeth. They're filter feeders. Yeah, but they were a nuisance to the fishermen out there. They threw into their nets and all kinds of problems. And so Pop and his friend Henry Leppert. Henry was a French blacksmith who worked a lot with the abalone industry, the Japanese fishermen. He would develop and build and make abalone prize and different kinds of metal objects they may have needed that they could not get from Japan. And they had this idea that they would go out and they would take folks out from the Hotel Del Monte in Pop's abalone boat. He had his own abalone boat to hunt abalone for him. They'd pick out on the boat and they would take folks from the Hotel Del Monte, and for 25 cents, you could harpoon a basking shark. And in those days, there were a number of old Portuguese whalers still living in Monterey, and they'd go out with them and they would tell stories of whaling in the Monterey Bay and then and show them how to throw the harpoon. Oftentimes, once they harpoon that shark, it will pull the boat. It's a big animal. And then when it would slow down, they would kill it. And then because the boat was equipped with an air compressor for the abalone divers, they would often pump the carcass of that shark with air, so it would stay floating on the surface, and flip it up onto its belly, and then Henry Leppert would get on the belly of the shark and dance on it for the tourists who were out there for the basking shark hunt. So here's our basking shark brought in. This is also near the Monterey Wharf. There wasn't at that time in the early 20s. There really wasn't a lot of there was no real market for these animals. They weren't doing with them. It was strictly for tourism. That's the only reason they were doing this. Then in 1925, this family, this is the Gilkey family. He and his brother had a boat called the Two Brothers. They began to take tourists out, hunt basking sharks out in the bay, and they worked with a guy named Thomas Machado, who was a harpoonist. Thomas Machado was the son and grandson of Portuguese whalers, so he sort of continued that family tradition. And they would go out, and they oftentimes would, once they harpooned the shark, they would actually jump on it and ride on it as it's pulling the boat. A basking shark's skin is like little teeth, and actually rip up their legs when they did that kind of thing. So beginning mid-1920s, a guy named Max Schaefer, who was in the reduction business, that's where they were taking the heads, tails, and the guts of those sardines and other fishes and grinding up and using it for other products, NLP fertilizer, that kind of thing. That's where real money was in the sardine fishery. And Max Schaefer also, by the way, owned a number of buildings on Cannery Row, including the building that Ed Ricketts eventually bought down there. But he began to buy these basking sharks for their liver oil. That's what he was after. And the livers can be quite large, 600, 700 pounds. Have 700, 800 gallons of sort of a low-grade vitamin A in there. And so he was buying that and producing this stuff called sun shark liver oil, nature's own tonic. And this is the inside. It talks about how it will cure anything that ails you. You name it, it cured it. It promotes health and growth in children, builds up resistance to attacks of the usual ailments of youth, and furnishes energy for the strenuous exertions of youth. In older people, it is deferring trouble common with age, enables them to keep on enjoying their full bodily vigor and energy to perform their daily tasks. Essentially, this was the Viagra of its day, although I actually doubt that it did anything. This is another group that got into the fishery here. I love this image of these two guys out there, the third guy in the little cabin there. And once they would harpoon these sharks, there was a line on the harpoon which wrapped around the barrel that you could see on the back of that boat. And so the barrel would just go into the water, and then it would slow. The idea of it would drag through the water, slowing that shark down until they could finally get up to it and finally kill it. But they actually would use old water heater tanks the floats to help drag down that shark right there. This industry began to slow down in the beginning of the 1930s. This wonderful movie, Claudette Colbert and I Cover the Waterfront, one of the great Hollywood opuses. I'm sure you've all heard of this wonderful film. This film actually was produced in 1931. And the premise of this movie is that Claudette Colbert is the daughter of a sort of a corrupt fisherman, and a journalist who was knew he was corrupt and was trying to find dirt on the guy. And what the guy was doing, the fisherman, he was smuggling in Chinese laborers, Chinese workers into California in the belly of sharks. And so when they made the film, they needed to get a scene where they're catching these sharks. And they knew there was this basset shark fishery going on up in Monterey. So they sent the film crew up to Monterey. And it was right at the end of the Monterey sardine season. And so they were able to contract with a guy named Sal Coletto. Sal Coletto was a Monterey sardine fisherman, had a boat called the Dante Alighieri. And he contracted Sal in his boat. And they also hired Thomas Machado to work on the boat, work in the movie with them. And they went out and shot several scenes in the film here. And now I hope this is going to do what it's supposed to do, because this is a video scene from the movie. And it works on my computer. Let's hope you guys can all see this. Let me know if you can't see it. So there is the Dante Alighieri in Monterey Bay, bringing in that basking shark. Now note the teeth. As I mentioned, they had no teeth. That was the Hollywood did that part. That's the evil fisherman there, and his goon next to him. There's some of those Chinese workers. Brought onto the deck, the Dante Alighieri there. There's Sal Coletto actually up on the top there. And part of his crew, actually, other guys on the boat there. And they were happy about this because they weren't fishing sardines this man. They made a lot of extra money. They said a shark, there is a shark. They spent several days out in Monterey Bay doing this, filming these scenes. And there they go, on for their hunt. By the way, Henry Leopard made most of these points, these points of this fishery. And that's Thomas Machado right there at the bow of that boat. Boom. So that is the closest thing you'll ever see to an actual Monterey whaling hunt in Monterey Bay right there. Of course, they get dragged through the water. You could actually, I spent several years trying to track this film down, and I finally found it. And as soon as I did, the statute of limitations for this film ran out, and now the film is available anywhere. The copyright. You can find it, I think, on YouTube. All right. So This is a guy. So the fishery went on to about 1936. Max Schaefer's plant actually burned down to the ground. He was the only one buying these things, and so that kind of ended that fishery at that time. It was revitalized in 1948 by this guy here, this guy named Freeman Whitey Arbo. Whitey Arbo was a fisherman in Moss Landing, and he was out fishing, I believe, for some rockfish, and he caught a couple of basking sharks. And so he brought them into Moss Landing, and a whole new fishery was developed. And so he went out and he made some points, and then he went out and began fishing. He built this little thing on the bow of his boat that he could step up higher above it, so he could harpoon those sharks down there. And it actually went on to the early 1950s. They bring it into Moss Landing. At that time, Newt Hoven's cannery had a cannery at Moss Landing, and he was buying these basking sharks. Well, again, he was just buying the livers. And as I mentioned, these livers can be very large. So they are taking liver out of one of these basking sharks. Whitey told me that he got one that weighed 1,500 pounds. And it had like 1,000 gallons of oil inside that liver. But they're only making like a nickel a pound for these things. So they really weren't making a whole lot of money at doing this. It really went on into the early 1950s, but they began to incorporate things that was utilized by other fishers. In particular, the Monterey basking shark fishermen began to use pilots who would take off from Moss Landing, and they would fly over the bay looking for basking sharks and radio to the boats where they can find them, which is something that the Monterey sardine fishermen began to use later on right there. So what the Hogan was doing with all this oil is that they were using it for paint and for soap. But when they found out they put it in the paint wouldn't dry. They put it in the soap wouldn't lather. So really, but it was really good for tanning leather. And so that's really the main product came out. They were tanning leather. But they're also using it for dog and cat food at that time too. So here is a photograph, and I know I've shown this before, but this is a wonderful photograph of the Duarte family. This is one of their businesses that they had near the Monterey Wharf. This is their sort of marine museum. You can see the glass bottom boats and fishing tackle. There's whalebone products right here, abalone shell, taxidermist, whalebone, book covers for sale. This is whalebone products here. This is whalebone vertebrae with the carmonition painted on it. Whalebone chair here. I've actually sat in one of these chairs, not very comfortable. Whalebone stool right here. And so Duarte actually would work with the local commercial fishermen in those days, kind of like an agent. And no pun intended, he would hook them up with the sport fishermen coming to stay at the Hotel Del Monte. In those early days, the Monterey commercial fishermen all pretty much fished the same way. They fished with long hand lines and sort of gill nets, which is a net you stretch across your net. The fish in the net get caught by the gills, which is pretty good for most things, but it really wasn't a really effective way to catch salmon in the bay, especially these big king salmon. So they really weren't making a lot of money. So Mr. Duarte would hook them up with those sport fishermen coming to stay at the Hotel Del Monte, like this gentleman right here, a guy named J. Parker Whitney. And Mr. Whitney, he was, by the time he was in his early 30s, he was a pretty wealthy guy. He and his two brothers came to California during the California gold rush and made their money not in the gold fields, but made their money selling supplies to gold miners on their way to the gold field. They also actually crossbred a sheep from Hollister with one from Australia, which proved to be very popular, and they were very wealthy. And so he spent the rest of his life traveling the world, doing the things that he loved, which was hunting and fishing. And he spent a lot of time at the Hotel Del Monte fishing salmon out in the bay out there. This is him on the Monterey Wharf with his fishing guide. So a lot of these Monterey fishermen would, as I said, would hook up and go out and work as fishing guides, and like they would do in Europe, showing the good place to fish the salmon out in the bay out there. Well, these sport fishermen were very sophisticated fishers for their time and had the newest in technology. Here is a mailer that the Hotel Del Monte would send out to these sport fishermen to try to entice them to come back to the hotel. I love this image. You see the boat right here. Here's our commercial fisherman here, and here's our sport fisherman here. And you notice that he's wearing a suit. And then this is the back side of that, or the inside of that particular mailer. It says, result of fishing on Monterey Bay and Pebble Beach today: salmon, sea trout, I'm not sure what that was, sea bass, tuna, rock cod, barracuda, yellowtail, these are mostly warm water fishes, things you don't normally find in the Monterey Bay unless there's an El Nino going on. But what I love about this is this little drawing of a salmon rig that they developed. Actually, J. Parker Whitney was partly responsible for this, and it sort of revolutionized the salmon fishery. And the idea that was that the salmon would then hit this line here, and then it would drop the weight into the water, and then the line would be a single line without the weight, and they wouldn't get tangled, and they were able to really fight that fish and bring it right in. And also, J. Parker Whitney is the guy that introduced the idea of fishing salmon in the bay with a rod and reel. And he also introduced this idea of using trolling lines, which is a line with a lot of hooks on it that you drag through the water, which is a really effective way to catch salmon out in the Monterey Bay. So our Monterey commercial fishermen all said, well, wait a minute, I think we can do that. And I have salmon landing records to go back to that time, and you can see it. In 1893, they caught maybe 5,000 pounds worth of salmon. Then they switched to that new trolling technology, which is part of this you see here. And in 1895, they caught over 95,000 pounds worth of salmon out of that Monterey Bay, which revolutionized the fisheries. This is a boat called the Ohio. This is the Monaca family. They came to Monterey in 1906 to fish salmon. I should point out that the salmon fishery was huge, not just in Monterey, but in California. But in Monterey, it was Japanese fishermen that were doing it. It was just a huge, huge fishery. Here is one of those beautiful salmon boats you see right there. Japanese fisherman on his boat. This was taken about 1916, but after the Monterey Boat Works first opened, and you can see the proud salmon fisherman here with his American flag, Japanese flag, and his partner right there, leaning up against the boat right there. And then these are salmon fishermen, mostly all Japanese. To give you an idea of how large this was, at the end of this photograph, by the way, was taken in 1909. At the end of 1909 salmon season, the Monterey Daily Cypress, which was the local newspaper then, reported at the end of this 1909 salmon season, there were 185 salmon boats fishing the Monterey Bay. 145 of them were Japanese owned, and they're catching an average of 1 million pounds of king salmon in 3 months. 1 million. The 1909 salmon season, they caught 1,500,000 pounds worth of king salmon in Monterey Bay. In 1910, they caught 2 million pounds of king salmon in the Monterey Bay. Big, big fishery out there. That got the attention of this guy right here, this guy named Frank Booth. Frank Booth was in the salmon business up along the Sacramento River around the turn of the 20th century. At that time, that's where all the fishery in Northern California was really happening. At that time, the fishery wasn't doing that well. There was a depression going on in this country. They weren't getting a lot of salmon. So all those salmon processors up there all sort of formed together and formed this little co-op called the Sacramento River Packers Association, and heard the big lambing going on in Monterey, sent Mr. Booth down there to check it out. He goes, oh, this is great. Tried to get contracts with the Japanese fishermen, and they said, or you have good contracts to market in San Francisco. So he backs off a little bit and builds a little shed near the Monterey Wharf and begins to experiment with these large sardines that are appearing in the bay at the end of the salmon season. He needed starting fishing at this point because most of the Japanese were leaving Monterey at the end of that salmon season to go work in the ag field in the Central Valley of California, only to return into Monterey in the spring to start fishing salmon again. Also, as I'm sure you guys are all aware, at the turn of the 20th century, there's a great deal of anti-Japanese sentiment coming in this country, coming primarily from white workers who are convinced the Japanese are coming to take their job, which really wasn't the case. But in 1905, Mr. Booth says to the local newspaper, not going to hire any more Japanese. Easy call for him because he didn't really mean it. He was still going to buy salmon from them, return in the spring, and he already hired Japanese workers who were working in his cannery. But it was that instant he sent for the Sicilian fishermen who already worked for him up along the Sacramento River, fishing salmon, come down to Monterey to start fishing sardine here as a small secondary fishery in the fall and winter months. Salmon was king. Salmon was the big fishery in Monterey and California at that time. Here is one of those Sicilian fishermen with his daughter, 3 young daughters, very proud on his brand new Lampara boat. That refers to the type of netting that he used, what they use on the boat right here. And so here they are going to launch that boat by horse and buggy right into the Monterey Bay. you see here. And then this wharf you see here, this is the old railroad wharf, and also known as the Japanese wharf, because many of the Japanese fishermen would tie off on this wharf right here. And so here's a wonderful photograph of the early Sicilian fishermen fishing sardine right in the middle of the bay right here. And so a good fisherman knows, by the way, this guy right here, his name is Piatto Ferrante. And how this net now operates, it's got little lead weights on the bottom. It's got glass floats on the top. And so a good captain like Piatto Ferrante here knows that if you take care of your crew will take care of you. And look, this is what he would use to float those nets. He'd use these glass bottles. It's actually got a rounded bottom on it. In those days, you put a carbonated beverage in the bottle and it's upright. The carbonation will pop the cork. But it's on its side, it doesn't have that problem. You'd use these bottles. You'd fill these bottles with beer. Use them to float his nets in the cold water of the Monterey Bay. They're done fishing. They pull off the floats. Everybody had cold beer. So around that same time in the United States, people ate sardines. People ate sardines almost on a daily basis, kind of like we eat potato chips and crackers today. But the sardines they're eating were not the kind of sardines you get in Monterey or California. They're eating these little guys. The guys coming from the North Atlantic, coming from Europe. France was a big sardine producer at the turn of the 20th century. So I should point out that sardine is kind of a generic word. Almost all small silvery fish are referred to as a sardine. And what they catch in California is known as a pilchard or the true sardine, but they're big. It can be 7 to 8 inches. And people didn't like those big sardines. They wanted those little sardines there. And what were they doing with all that salmon? There wasn't any real market for it. They were sending it to San Francisco. They were smoking a salmon, but the real market was in Europe. It was 90% of it was going to Europe, and the majority of that was going to Germany. That's where the real market was. So what happened in the world in 1914? World War I, because of all that salmon going to Europe, all those sardines coming from Europe, and they just switched into heavily fished sardine along the California coast. There were sardine canneries in New York State and Maine, but those guys couldn't fish because there were German submarines out there in the Atlantic. Eventually, the sardine fishery becomes the largest fishery of a single fish in the history of the United States, all for a fish that no time ever in its history in Monterey was ever a popular fish to eat. Here, by the way, is the first national ad for Monterey sardines. Appears in a Sears and Roebuck catalog in 1905, down there being advertised as souse, those are pickling slices, broiled mackerel. They were selling these as Monterey mackerel. But even in 1905, the federal government said, you can't call those mackerel, they're not mackerel, those are sardines. So they actually marketed these fish initially to the African American communities as salmon sardines, and they marketed them to the Jewish communities as herring sardines. They tried all kinds of things to sell this fish. They used to produce these beautiful little recipe books. Or you go down to the cannon, they'd give you one, or they would mail you one, and had all these great recipes for sardine sandwiches and sardine rarebits and something called sardine balls. My favorite, though, was a sardine jello salad that was made with lime jello, chili sauce, and Monterey sardines. This is a group of Japanese fishermen, actually, but they were sardine fishermen working on their net here. This is near the Monterey Wharf. Actually near the Monterey, what I call the Japanese Wharf here. And this little boardwalk that you see here, this is a boardwalk that was built by the Hotel Del Monte, and it started at the hotel, wrapped its way all the way around the waterfront to the Monterey Wharf. And so here was a group of Monterey sardine fishermen early on unloading their sardines at the Monterey Wharf. And so that little Amparo obviously couldn't take all that fish, so they would pull these barges behind them called lighters. This was a small one, and they'd come in and they would bring their fish in into the Monterey Wharf there. So how does it become this big fishery? Well, as I mentioned, the war is a big part of it. But then here's California welcomes the world. This is the Panama Pacific International Exposition that opened in San Francisco in 1915. I know I talked about this last time, but besides Abalone, it really introduced a lot of things at this World's Fair. It was very, very important and so here is a business card for the Booth Cannon Company, Monterey Packing Company, which I actually found on eBay many years ago. eBay was the museum curator's best friend. And when it came up on eBay at that time, I couldn't really read what it said. It says, other than I could see Booth's Cannery. I'd never seen a business card before, but I noticed it had been written on. Someone wrote on the card here, but I couldn't read what it said. But I bid on it and I actually won it. I think I paid like $40 for it. And when I got the card, I could read what it said. It says, near U.S. Fisheries Food Products Building Exposition. So this is from that World's Fair where it introduced Monterey sardines to the world right there. Very, very important. So as I mentioned, the war strikes out. This is an advertisement for Booth's Sardine Cannery for World War I. In peace or war, Booth Sardine, of course, right? And so that there's the demand for sardines begins to really grow again because they couldn't get the East Coast sardines, they couldn't get those North Atlantic sardines. All they could get were those California Western sardines. And so the industry begins to grow. This is an early photograph of the Carmel Canning Company and its labor force here. As you probably already know, the majority of the labor force in these canneries were women. I love this particular image of these cannery workers. And if you look closely, you can see the apron that they're wearing. These are made out of newspapers, all right? That they just fold the newspaper to make the apron. And then you can see these probably a mother and her daughter here holding hands. So in Monterey at that time, everybody had some kind of connection to these sardine canneries. And as the industry grew, more and more people went to work into the canneries. But as I mentioned, the industry, that Monterey sardine at no point in its history was ever a popular fish to eat. So the real money was never in the canned products. The real money was always in the byproduct. Like this right here. This is actually an advertisement for Booth's sardine, which actually was chicken feed. And that's where the real money was, in animal feed, fertilizers. Next time you guys all go to the market and you buy yourself a chicken for dinner, you can thank this guy, this sardine, for it. Because prior to 1920, the chicken industry in California was not doing very well. People did not eat chicken like we do today. You know, it was kind of expensive. Began to produce this cheap chicken feed, the head, tails, and offal, the guts of the Monterey sardine. The chickens loved it, thrived on it. More and more chickens are being produced. The price of chicken went down. People began to buy chicken. My friend Bill Ripley, who was a retired biologist, used to say, the Foster Farm chicken owes its life to the bones of the Monterey sardine. Absolutely true right there. So again, as the industry goes, the boats get bigger. This is, again, one of those Lampara boats. This is much larger now. Look at all the guys on this boat here. There are actually 14 guys on the boat right here. But there was no radios on this boat. There's no depth finders on this boat. The most technology on this boat, these guys would take a piece of steel and they would put some lard or butter on one end of that piece of steel, tie a rope around it, and drop it into the bay, and pull it back up. And there's sand stuck on that piece of that steel. That means it's not rocky down there, and they can lay out their nets. In the early days, they would actually fish sardines in the daytime. And the fishermen would go out and they said they would listen for the split in the water that schooling fish would make. But they learned that sardines are nocturnal and feed off this little small phosphorescent animal. Began to fish for sardines at night when the moon is at its darkest, what they call the dark of the moon. They go out and look for this bioluminescence that could be an acre in size. So here is our sardine fishermen on the Lampara boat, and they're unloading. This is the big barge. This one can carry up to 60 tons of sardine. And so they're unloading with this little barrel you see right here into this box right here. So it could take a long time to unload that fish. Then you can see another barge right out here in the bay out there. So again, as the industry starts to get bigger, there's a bigger demand. The boats are going to continue to get bigger. This is Monterey's past, present, and future, and the sardine fishery, all in this one photograph, all right here. Here's that little Lampara boat right here. This is what's known as a half ringer or Japanese round haul, again, referring to the net. And this is a brand new purse seiner without the turntable. This boat, this half ringer Japanese round haul, is a cross between this boat and this boat. Here are two brand new purse seiners here with the turntable. And how that operated, the net is piled onto the turntable. And when they go out to fish, they unload they lay out the net. They take a small boat, will be dropped into the water. It takes the front end of that net, and then it goes clockwise, and the big boat will counterclockwise, wrapped around that school of fish. This net can be up to 1,500 foot in circumference. They were huge. This boat, by the way, when this picture was taken, it cost up to $30,000. mean, that was a lot of money in 1930, and that does not include the net, I might add, which is another $10,000 or $15,000. You're talking close to a $45,000 investment during the Depression. And that was a huge amount of money, but they were able to get loans mainly from the Bank of Italy, which became the Bank of America. By the way, of these turntables, I've been told that in Southern California, the turntables will turn to the right. In Monterey, they turn to the left. I like to think that's a political thing. To give you an idea of how fast this industry was growing, this is the Booth Sardine Cannery. By the way, Booth's Cannery was the only cannery that was in Monterey proper. All the other canneries were on in what we call New Monterey. And as this fishery began to develop, there was a big push to stop this fishery from even developing, coming primarily from the Hotel Del Monte, who had a lot of political power in this community, a lot of economic power in this community. They didn't want it because they were concerned if they built sardine canneries along the waterfront, then the tourists wouldn't come to Monterey. So they passed these petitions around trying to stop this fish from even developing. But the city of Monterey said, wait a minute, there's money to be made here. Said, all right, all you sardine processors go way down there at the end of Ocean View Avenue where nobody goes. And that's how Cannery Row becomes Cannery Row. And Mr. Booth could stay where he already was because he was already there. And that's how he became the only cannery in Monterey. And they had drawn up blueprints to build canneries starting from where the wharf number 2 is, all on that waterfront. But they never did get a chance to do that. So this is the W.F. Wood unloading. You can see he just beginning to unload because you can see how low he is in the water right here. So we've got a lot of fish on that boat. They'll drop this bucket down into his hold, then it goes up into the fish, into the weight room here. That's how the fishermen got paid. So the boat owners would negotiate every year with the cannery owners for prices per ton of their fish. And in fact, in the beginning of about 1920, they can cut an annual event for these boat owners to go out on strike for higher prices for their fish. And these strikes could last for several weeks. So if you're a crewman and your boat owner's out on strike, then you're not fishing. You're not fishing, you're not making any money. You're not making any money, you can't pay your rent, you can't feed your family. So after a particularly long strike in 1927, all these crewmen formed their own union, the Monterey Fishers Protective Union. Then on November 28th, 1925, they're all fired by the boat owners for forming this union. We don't need you, they said. We're going to bring in these big sardine boats, these purse seiners. No, and Newt Hogan, Hogan's cannery, said, well, anybody go out there and fish sardine. I'll just send out my cannery workers. Well, after about 6 weeks of seasick cannery workers, those crewmen had their own union. So again, to show you how this fishery is growing, this is that same scene taken just 6 months later. Look, this is June of 1930. Look, they've added the wharf here. They've extended that fish ladder right here. They've expanded the size of that weight room right here. By the way, this is the Dante Alighieri, that same boat you saw in that little film clip that I showed right there. And then, by the way, once the fish are all weighed, they'll go across this, what's called a crossover by conveyor belt down into the cannery right there. So as the canneries begin to grow, the workers are needed, and workers are coming from all over the United States, particularly coming from Oklahoma and places like that, out of the Dust Bowl, they used to say. This is a scene out of the Grapes of Wrath, right? This is a group of men at the union or at the cannery office trying to get a job to work in the Monterey canneries right there. So in the Monterey canneries, there was no union for any of these workers until 1938. So there was no consistency as far as payment or as far as working conditions within the canneries. This is a time card for a female worker named Dorothy Wheeler. I knew Dorothy. She went to work for Hogan's Cannery in the early 1930s. This is from 1936. And you can see, according to this time card, they wrote it in ink that she worked 8 hours, 5 days a week. Well, we know that she worked more than that because you did not go home until you put all that fish up because there was no refrigeration in those canneries. You might work 10, 12 hours a day sometimes. So they wrote down she worked 40 hours, but we know it was more than that. And you can see, let's take a look on the other side, close up of that side. Look, you can see they wrote She wrote a sixth day where they wrote it in pencil and then erased it because it was illegal to do that then. And she made $14.23 for that week there, working at Hogan's Cannery. And then in 1938, the AFL came in and began to unionize all these cannery workers. It was a hard struggle, but they finally were able to negotiate a union contract with all the cannery owners. And then the next year, the CIO, which was a separate union at that time, kind of considered to be a radical union, came in and tried to sign up all these workers and said, we'll get you better pay, better working conditions. And a lot of workers signed up for them. And they went to negotiate with the cannery owners, and the cannery owners said, forget it. We're already dealt with the AFL. We're not dealing with the CIO. And so all the CIO workers who had signed up were not allowed to work in the Monterey canneries for the 1938-39 season. This photograph was taken about 2 weeks before Christmas, 1939. It's what's known as the Children's Christmas Strike. And so all those CIO workers sent their children on a strike, and they marched from downtown Monterey all the way down to Canyon Row. And you can see they're carrying all these signs. One of these signs actually says that Santa Claus can't come to my house because Daddy works for the CIO. Eventually, those unions merged, and there was one big union. So I know you guys are all adults, and you all can deal with this. Ed Ricketts was not the only marine biologist on Cannery Row, nor was even the most important biologist on Cannery Row. These guys were right here. These were the biologists for the California Department of Fish and Game. Fish and Game came to Monterey around the turn of the 20th century, actually even before the turn of the 20th century, but they opened offices up at Hopkins Marine Station in the 1920s to monitor the sardine fishery as it really begins to develop. This woman, her name is Frances Clark. Frances Clark was way ahead of her time. She was the first person within Fish and Game to receive a PhD, which she got in 1925, but they weren't sure what to do with her. So they said, let's make her the librarian. Where she took a series of books and set it on a man's desk and built it in one of the premier fisheries libraries in the world. That's now here in the Monterey area, actually. But she went on to run all the sardine programs that Fish and Game did here in California. And she wrote articles to the Monterey Herald. In 1939, she wrote an article to the Monterey Herald because at that time there was a big concern that the large sardines were disappearing from the bay. And she said, well, where are all the large sardines? She said, they're all in the cans, which is a line that Ed Ricketts stole from Frances Clark. And so you can see this is a guy named N.B. Schofield and Richard. This is Richard Croker here, and this is J.B. Phillips right here, who took a lot of the photographs that you're seeing here today. This is J.B. Phillips here. And so in 1936, Frances Clark created this program where they would go out and they would tag sardines. They're also doing this in Southern California. And they got into the bay and they would get fish from the fishermen, and they caught them themselves. They bring onto the boat. Here's Frances Clark here. And where they bring them onto the boat, where they would then take a scalpel and first they'd weigh them and measure them. Then she'd take a scalpel and open up that sardine right underneath this anal fin, and she'd insert a little numbered metal tag into the sardine. It didn't hurt the sardine when they did that. Then they took firecrackers or cherry bomb, threw over the side of the boat to scare away all the sea lions. Then they dumped all the sardines back out into the bay. She had installed at all the big reduction plants these big 50-pound magnets. And once a week or so, this big fish and game biologist would go through there to pick up all the stuff the magnet had picked up. A friend of mine, a guy I know who worked for Fish and Game, would go in, and a guy named Bill Ripley. He went to work for Fish and Game in 1940, and that was his job. I said, Rip, what kind of stuff you get? Get this bucket full of nails and screws and old pieces of track and old tools and stuff to sort out the final little number metal tags. It was actually a very effective program. Because of that, Frances Clark was able to say in 1939, you guys need to cut this fishery in half. Again, nobody paid any attention. These guys had no power. All they could do was make recommendations. All the power lies, it still does today with the Fish and Game Commission. The Fish and Game Commission is a group of political appointees. In those days, mostly businessmen. In some cases, businessmen who'd never even seen the ocean before, who are more sympathetic to other businessmen like cannery owners who are hiring their own scientists to tell them what they wanted to hear. What's also interesting about this tagging program is they're beginning to look at how this was affecting all the other fisheries around it. So it really was sort of ecological view of what was going on in the bay. They wouldn't have called it that, but that's what they were doing down there. So I put this in there because this is what's known as a Christmas tree. And so sardine and anchovy oftentimes will swim together. Anchovies are smaller than the sardine, will oftentimes get caught in the fisherman's net. Because this anchovy will secrete this mucus that will ruin this cotton netting. Although they treat it, they still can ruin that netting. So they have to get rid of those anchovies so they can save the net, because they mentioned the net is very, very expensive. So for a very short period, this was run by the Rappa family. As many of you know, there were big canning vats on the wharf right about here, where the fishermen would bring their nets in, they would tan them in this tan bark solution, and that would treat the nets, which they did once a week. Well, often for a few years, they ran this barge. You go out and meet the fishermen, and so it has hot water in one of these big vats that would kill all those anchovies, and then there was a tanning solution in the other net. This only went on for a couple of years. It just didn't prove to be effective where they had operated off the wharf. But I'm sure you all recognize what this is on the Monterey Wharf today. So there is my friend Frank Manaka. This is his boat, the Western Explorer, coming in with 100 tons of sardine here. Look how low he's sitting in the water here. This is a wonderful photograph taken about 1948 with a big brailing net there, starting to unload their fish into the sardine hoppers. And there's my friend Frank Manaka. Frank Manaka was about 18 when this photograph was taken. He was the first Japanese fisherman all of California to have one of those kind of boats. He grew up in Monterey, went to Monterey school. Monterey's a small town. He knew everybody. He went to school with everybody. He played baseball on the Monterey High School baseball team. He was a pitcher. He tells me he was a good pitcher, and I believe him. He got to see Joe DiMaggio play baseball at Jack's Park, right across the street from JACL Hall on Adams Street here in Monterey in about 1920. And he said, if Joe DiMaggio, the son of a fisherman, can be a baseball player, Frank Manaka, the son of a fisherman, can be a baseball player. But Frank's dad said, nope, you're going to be a fisherman. So when he graduated from Monterey High School, he became a fisherman and got that boat. But I said, Frank, where'd you guys get the money? I mean, they weren't a wealthy family. And as I mentioned, those were very expensive boats. He told me there was an engine company in San Francisco called Enterprise Engine Company that just designed this brand new kind of experimental diesel engine, came down to Monterey. Said, anybody willing to put our engine to your boat? We'll carry the note for you. Frank is the only guy that raised his hand. That's how he got his boat. The Ohio number 3, by the way, not named after the state, but in Japanese, Ohio means good morning. So this is Frank Manaka. This is his brother here, and this is his boat, the Western Explorer. And this is what we call a deck load of sardine right here. These guys are standing knee deep in Monterey sardines right there. And here you are unloading a good load, unloading the fish. Right. This is also late 1940s when this picture was taken. Into the sardine hoppers. So the hoppers made their appearance in Monterey in 1926, which was an idea of Newt Hogan. He had seen these kind of hoppers working in agricultural fields in California, where the hopper is out in the middle of the field. They put your fruits and vegetables into the hopper that goes by conveyor belt into the cannery. He figured, why can't they work out on the Monterey Bay? So his engineers designed these systems that operate about 500 feet off the canneries. And there was work with the marine pump, and they would drop the fish into the hoppers, and they would be funneled down this little opening, and then the fish would be sucked into the canneries. These things could take up to 70 tons an hour. The power was so strong it literally would scale the fish as they went through it. Every cannery had at least one. Some of them had 2 of them, and Monterey Bay is the only place where they use this kind of delivery system. Nobody else used anything like this. And they're all locally made by the Sino brothers at the Monterey Boat Works, all made out of redwood. So when the fishery does collapse, and they have plenty of warnings about it, you look, this is Canyon Row, about 1950, I can roll a bowling ball down there and not hit a darn thing. So they began to go further and further out to get sardines. This is at Santa Barbara. They're unloading sardines here at the wharf of Santa Barbara onto this little fish ladder here, and into the truck here. And then they're trucking them up to Monterey. Here's the truck being unloaded here, and then up this fish ladder into the Hogan cannery in Monterey, where And then here they are pumping it out of that truck, and then again into the holding cannery there. And then Newt Hogan had this idea after World War II. He bought one of those landing crafts that they used like at Normandy. This is a large one. This one would have unloaded tanks and that kind of thing. And they came Army surplus. He bought one and he converted it into this floating sardine cannery. The idea being this would go up to the boat and they'd get all the fish and then load it on, and they would begin the process right there on the boat. Well, you're looking at is one and only voyage right there. So this is sort of Monterey's version of the sardine Titanic right there. I don't know what happened to this barge. It just disappeared from history there. So, but they still fish sardine. In fact, you can go to Safeway today and buy some California sardines. What they do, they fish them, and they're not fishing them right now, but they fish them here. They do fish them in Mexico. They catch the same kind of fish in Mexico, and they'll ship them to China. They ship them to Vietnam, where they'll can them. Then they'll ship them back here, and you can go to Safeway and buy them for about $2.50. Look for a can called California Girl. Those are often caught along the West Coast here, maybe even in Monterey. This is a photograph that I took a few years ago at the Tuskegee Fish Market in Tokyo, Japan. These are California sardine, fresh ones that were being sold right there in Tokyo. And they were very popular right there. And then my favorite label, of course, sardines and beer. What could be better, right? Right there. And then, so all my years I worked at the Monterey Maritime Museum, I talked about sardines a lot. I mean, so much so that I finally had to get my sardine tattoo. And so there it is right there. And I think I bored you guys all enough. So thank you. If you have any questions, or you can always email me at timsardine@yahoo.com. So thank you very much.